Before we dive in, just a quick note for those who want to go further than what is publicly shared here. Subscribers to the Old World Timber email list receive carefully researched ebooks, detailed step-by-step woodworking videos, and exclusive content not published anywhere else. This channel exists for people who care about timber as a material, its behavior over decades, and, the subtle wisdom embedded in historic construction practices. In modern construction, speed is often mistaken for efficiency. Buildings are erected quickly, timelines are compressed, and modern tools promise that faster always equals better. Yet centuries of surviving timber structures tell a different story. Old World carpenters understood that rushing the process, cutting corners, accelerating drying, ignoring seasonal factors was far more costly than careful, deliberate work. Those who fell into the speed trap often saw their timber warp, twist, or fail decades sooner than intended. The remarkable structures that still stand today were not built by the fastest hands, but by those who respected the limits of wood, timing, and weather. Old builders refused to let speed compromise material integrity. In historical timber construction, speed was never a primary measure of skill. Carpenters and joiners recognized that wood is a living material long after it leaves the tree. Its fibers shrink, swell, and adjust to moisture gradients over time. Rushing installation or assembly often locked in stress that would later manifest as twisting, checking, or joint failure. In surviving medieval halls, barns, and temples, the evidence is clear. Joints are precise, timbers are massive, and surfaces bear the marks of patient workmanship rather than hurried cuts. Modern timelines ignore these realities. Kiln-dried boards are installed as though they are immutable. Yet decades later they can deform, lose bearing capacity, or compromise joint integrity. Old builders worked in rhythm with wood, not against it. They understood that timber's longevity required pacing. One of the most overlooked aspects of old construction is the time invested in preparation. Beams were often hewn or sawn slowly, with careful attention to grain orientation. This allowed stress in the wood to release gradually, producing a more stable material for framing. Posts were sometimes left to season partially in place, and joinery was cut to accommodate slight seasonal movements. This wasn't inefficiency, it was deliberate risk management. Every additional day spent cutting, planing, or fitting reduced the likelihood of future failure. When builders bypassed these steps for speed, the consequences were subtle at first, slight deflection, minor checking, but cumulative over years. Fast construction might look impressive in the short term, but the material remembers. History shows us that buildings built with patience outlast those built with haste. Mortise and tenon, pegged and scarf joints were crafted with an understanding of wood movement. Carpenters sized tenons slightly undersized relative to the mortise to allow seasonal swelling. Pegs were sometimes tapered or shaped to let wood settle without splitting. These design choices reveal a refusal to trap wood in a rigid, stress-inducing configuration, a common speed trap in modern practice, where joints are cut to the millimetre for fast assembly and rigid compliance. The lesson is clear. Longevity often depends less on immediate strength and more on allowing wood to find equilibrium under load. Old World carpenters sized, shaped and oriented timber to accommodate decades of movement, rather than forcing wood into an arbitrary perfection that time would punish. Construction in the past was, well, intimately tied to seasonal cycles. Timber was harvested at times when sap content was low, reducing internal moisture. Beams were allowed to air-dry in ventilated stacks before installation. Builders often adjusted schedules based on weather, recognizing that rain, frost or high humidity could compromise material integrity if work proceeded too quickly. Modern construction schedules rarely account for these variables. Contractors measure time in days and weeks, not cycles of moisture content or fibre stability. The result is a subtle but persistent acceleration of stress in wood, particularly in beams, joists and roof elements exposed to the elements. Historic carpenters refused to fall into this trap, recognizing that the pace of work must respect the pace of the material. Another strategy that slowed construction but enhanced durability was oversizing timbers. Beams, posts and rafters were often larger than required by immediate load calculations. This provided a buffer for environmental stress, shrinkage and unforeseen load increases. Modern codes allow minimal sizing, assuming perfect compliance and predictable conditions. Old builders knew conditions would not be perfect, and they sized accordingly. This principle also explains why many historic structures still function despite decades or centuries of weathering. The timbers were not stressed to their limits from the outset. Oversizing slowed construction, yes, but it ensured survival. Even after cutting, old timber was honestly handled slowly. Boards and beams were stacked for gradual drying, often in shaded, ventilated conditions. Rapid drying creates case hardening and internal stress, an issue modern builders often ignore when preferring kiln-dried stock for convenience. On-site acclimation allowed timbers to lose moisture evenly, reducing warping and checking after installation. Carpenters understood that a beam that appeared ready in a week might only stabilize over months. Speed in installation before stabilization was avoided. Old-world carpenters also accounted for exposure and finishing. Beams were placed to minimize direct water contact, roofs extended to protect walls, and joints were detailed to prevent pooling. Modern practices often treat finishing as a cosmetic or purely protective step, overlooking how these measures slow stress development. By pacing work around finishing and environmental control, old builders avoided the consequences of rushing. Perhaps the most important factor is assembly itself. Raising timber frames, positioning beams and pegging joints required patience. Historical accounts describe teams working in synchrony, often over weeks or even months, carefully fitting components. The time spent was not arbitrary. It allowed builders to observe how beams settled, how joints reacted to load, and how the structure responded to preliminary forces. Modern assembly often prioritizes speed and scheduling, which can, conceal subtle misalignments or stress points until they manifest years later. The old speed trap is not about rejecting efficiency entirely. It's about recognizing the limits of timber as a material. Wood responds slowly but persistently to environmental and mechanical stress. Ignoring that reality for the sake of construction speed creates problems that will appear long after handshakes and inspections are complete. Understanding this principle encourages modern builders to respect timber's pace. It informs design decisions, joinery choices, and installation timing. It explains why some well-built modern structures fail quietly within decades, while centuries-old halls remain functional with only minimal maintenance. Survival is not a product of speed, it is a product of deliberate pacing, empirical knowledge, and observation. Timber is not a static material, and time cannot be shortcut without consequence. Old-world carpenters offer lessons in patience, observation, and respect for material behavior. Their avoidance of the speed trap was deliberate, informed, and effective. For builders, historians, and survival-minded craftspeople, these lessons remain vital. They explain why wood fails, why some buildings endure, and why thoughtful pacing can be as critical as species selection, joinery quality, or finishing techniques. If you value understanding timber at this depth, subscribe to the Old World Timber email list. You will gain access to research, historical analysis, and project demonstrations that go beyond what is possible in video alone. The wisdom of centuries-old carpenters has survived because they understood the material better than most modern manuals allow. Paying attention to their methods ensures that your work, whether restoration or construction, can endure in the same way.